When Amanda Robson's husband, Wade, first told her that he had suffered years of childhood sexual abuse at the hands of Michael Jackson, she grew worried for the safety of their son. "Is there any confusion as to what is appropriate and how you love him?" she says she asked Wade, in the HBO documentary Leaving Neverland.
Her concern, that as an alleged victim of molestation her husband may have been a threat that spread that evil to another generation, reflects a view so embedded in the culture that it rarely merits much discussion. But the cycle of abuse, as it's often understood, is nothing less than psychological Lysenkoism, the belief, in the absence of clear, empirical evidence, that lived abuse tends to propagate across generations and reproduce itself in specific ways.
The facts about the intergenerational transmission of maltreatment, as scholars call it, are very complicated, and while there's some truth to the idea as it's generally portrayed, there's also a fair amount of falsehood. Michael Jackson's story, in particular, has long been framed by this assumption. His most eccentric habits, the private amusement park and movie theater, the slumber parties that he often had with prepubescent boys, and so on, were often said to be the outcome of the performer's own troubled and pilfered childhood.
Jackson was so afraid of being in the presence of his physically abusive father, Joe Jackson, that it made him vomit, he told Oprah Winfrey in a 1993 interview. His sister Latoya Jackson also said that Joe beat Michael and alleged that he sexually abused both her and another sister too. There were unsubstantiated rumors that Michael was also a victim of sexual abuse.
This history has for years been cited as if it were an explanation. All of Jackson's oddities seem to be reactions to what he suffered as a child, wrote Jacob Weisberg in Slate in 2005, in what was then, and still remains, a conventional appraisal of the facts. The same pop psychology was applied again just last month, in another TV documentary about a superstar musician and his alleged sexual abuse of children.
Lifetime surviving R. Kelly includes footage of the singer's 2012 interview with Tavis Smiley, in which Kelly reports that he was himself molested by someone in his family starting at the age of 7. "When you're a child, whatever you're taught, it goes with you," Kelly says. A clinical psychologist, who appears on screen shortly after, concurs.
As victims of such abuse get older, she suggests, they want to make sure that they're always in that power position, and there's really no more powerful position in a sexual relationship than to be the abuser of a child. The folk wisdom undergirding this idea might be older, but the theory of intergenerational transmission of abuse, as it's propounded by criminologists and psychologists, seems to have taken hold in the middle of last century.
In 1940, two psychiatrists, Loretta Bender and Frank Curran, published observations of homicidal children and adolescents who were under their care in New York City. They concluded that many identified themselves with aggressive parents and seemed to pattern after their behavior.
In the early 1960s, this suggestion that the abused become abusive to others was taken up again amid a burgeoning concern over the physical battery of children. It seemed as though instances of child abuse were increasing. Cry rises from beaten babies, warned a Life magazine story in 1963, and clinicians wondered whether victims might internalize and reenact the violence.
One possible consequence which is overt, obvious and of great public concern, wrote clinician George Curtis in the American Journal of Psychiatry that year, is the probable tendency of children so treated to become tomorrow's murderers and perpetrators of other crimes of violence. Children might be learning from their parents' uncontrolled hostility, he said. The vernacular idea, monkey see, monkey do, expresses the same idea in terms understandable to everyone.
What began as a series of clinical observations and case histories would be elaborated, in the 1970s, with more careful, cross-sectional research. Researchers began to survey groups of juvenile delinquents to see how many of them reported having been abused, and the proportions turned out to be startlingly high.
A more recent audit of adult men incarcerated at a county jail, most of whom had been charged with felony crimes, found that 59% of the inmates said they'd been sexually molested by the age of 13. Even if it's true that victims of childhood abuse are at greater relative risk of committing crimes, including sexual assault, the most important numbers are the ones in the background.
The absolute risk that any given victim of sexual abuse will go on to become a sexual offender is very, very low. The Australian study, for example, found that among male sexual offenders, 96% had no official history of having been sexually abused.
More than 4/5 had no official history of being abused in any way. In light of those statistics, it's worth asking why we give so much credence to the cycle of abuse as an explanation. Maybe it feels safer to assume that cruelty is predictable, and that something so disturbing as the mistreatment of a child could be circumscribed and contained, drawn into and kept inside a pattern.
But the science is filled with too many nuances and caveats to allow such a clear-cut explanation. At least we know this much: while Michael Jackson and R. Kelly reportedly may have been a bit more prone to be arrested for mistreating children, there is no trodden pathway from victim to abuser. The cycles often stop,